You've been doing everything right. You cut the calories, you added the cardio, you even cleaned up your diet. But that layer of visceral fat, the one sitting deep around your organs, simply won't move. And here is what nobody has told you. The reason that fat is staying put might have nothing to do with your effort. It might have everything to do with a hormone your doctor never even tested. Most standard blood panels check your blood sugar, your cholesterol, your thyroid. But cortisol, the hormone that research shows is directly responsible for where your body chooses to store fat, is almost never included in a routine physical. Your doctor doesn't test it because it fluctuates throughout the day, because it's only ordered when specific adrenal diseases are suspected, and because, frankly, the chronic, low-grade elevation that's driving visceral fat accumulation in millions of people over 40 doesn't show up as a textbook abnormality. So your results come back normal. You get told to eat less and move more, and the fat doesn't move. Here is what recent research is actually showing us. Your body contains two very different types of fat. Subcutaneous fat, the kind you can pinch, sits just under the skin. Visceral fat sits deep inside your abdominal cavity, wrapped around your liver, your intestines, your kidneys. And the cells that make up visceral fat are fundamentally different from subcutaneous fat cells in one critical way. They are far more sensitive to cortisol. Research published in PMC, drawing on multiple lines of evidence from animal models and human tissue studies, found that visceral fat has significantly higher glucocorticoid receptor expression compared to subcutaneous fat. Think of glucocorticoid receptors as docking stations on fat cells. The more docking stations a fat cell has, the more it responds to cortisol, and visceral fat cells have far more of them. What this means in practice is striking. Even if your cortisol levels are not dramatically elevated, even if you're eating at a caloric deficit, your visceral fat compartment is disproportionately receptive to whatever cortisol your body is producing. The fat cells wrapped around your organs are primed to grow in a way that the fat beneath your skin simply is not. This is not a personal failing. This is biology, and it's biology that research is now beginning to give us tools to work with. Today, you are going to understand three things. First, what cortisol is actually doing inside your visceral fat cells at a receptor level. Second, why chronic stress and poor sleep are not just bad habits, they are active drivers of abdominal fat redistribution, even in people eating reasonable diets. And third, two interventions that published research suggests may help modulate this system: a phospholipid nutrient called phosphatidylserine, and a sleep protocol that targets cortisol's natural rhythm. Stay with me, because understanding this mechanism is the difference between blaming your willpower and targeting the actual biology. Let's go inside the fat cell itself. Every cell in your body contains receptors, proteins that act like keyholes, waiting for the right molecular key. Cortisol's key fits into something called the glucocorticoid receptor, or GR. Here is the critical biology. A study published in PMC reviewing the depot-specific actions of glucocorticoids on adipose tissue documented that visceral fat cells contain significantly higher glucocorticoid receptor expression than subcutaneous fat cells. A separate study published in the American Journal of Physiology, Cell Physiology, confirmed that 10 days of corticosterone treatment in a controlled model significantly increased visceral adipose tissue mass, but not subcutaneous mass, specifically attributing this disparity to differences in glucocorticoid receptor density between depots. Think of it like this. Imagine you have two types of soil in a garden. Both get the same amount of rain, but one type absorbs and holds it, while the other lets it run off. Visceral fat cells are the absorbent soil. The same cortisol signal that barely registers in subcutaneous fat causes active responses in visceral fat, promoting fat cell creation, supporting fat storage enzymes, and, in high insulin environments, actively directing triglycerides into these deep abdominal depots. And this is the part that explains what many people over 40 experience but cannot explain. Your visceral fat can be accumulating even when you are maintaining roughly stable body weight. Cortisol does not just add fat, it redirects where fat goes. Research published in PMC showed that cortisol exposure can simultaneously increase lipolysis in subcutaneous depots while promoting adipogenesis in visceral depots. This means your body may literally be moving fat from one location to another, from under your skin to around your organs. If you've lost weight from your arms and legs but your belly hasn't changed, this receptor biology may be part of the explanation. Your visceral fat cells are not the same as your subcutaneous fat cells. They are listening more carefully and responding more aggressively to every cortisol signal your body produces. You were designed to produce cortisol in short bursts. A threat appears, cortisol rises, your body mobilizes energy, the threat passes, cortisol drops. The entire system is built for acute stress that resolves. But chronic low-grade stress, the kind produced by financial pressure, work overload, relationship strain, and constant digital stimulation, creates a very different cortisol pattern. Instead of sharp spikes followed by full recovery, your cortisol baseline stays subtly elevated. The drop that's supposed to happen in the afternoon and evening gets shallower. The midnight nadir, the lowest point of your daily cortisol cycle, gets higher. And research shows the consequences are measurable in your visceral fat compartment. A review published in PMC examining the interactions between sleep, stress, and metabolism documented that chronic sleep restriction creates elevated cortisol concentrations, particularly in the afternoon and evening, and a flattening of cortisol's normal daily rhythm. The study noted that sleep-restricted volunteers showed a rate of free cortisol decrease that was nearly 6 times slower compared to fully rested individuals. That slower decline means more cumulative cortisol exposure to your visceral fat cells throughout the day. A landmark randomized controlled crossover study published in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology in 2022 made this concrete. 12 healthy, non-obese individuals were exposed to 14 days of restricted sleep, 4-hour sleep opportunity versus a control condition. Visceral fat area increased by approximately 11% during the sleep restriction condition. Subcutaneous fat showed a more modest increase. The researchers noted that even after recovery sleep, visceral fat continued to rise, leading them to conclude that inadequate sleep may be a previously unrecognized trigger for preferential visceral fat deposition. This is not about eating more during sleep deprivation, although that also occurs. This is about cortisol's receptor-level targeting of visceral tissue being amplified by disrupted sleep architecture. If you're over 40 and sleeping 6 hours or less consistently, or if you experience what researchers describe as wired and tired, exhausted but unable to switch off, your cortisol rhythm may be actively directing fat into your visceral compartment, regardless of what you're eating. Chronic stress and poor sleep are not simply lifestyle factors. Published research shows they create the precise hormonal conditions that amplify visceral fat's already heightened cortisol sensitivity. Before diving into this, a critical framing note. Neither of the interventions below is a fat loss treatment. They are potential tools for addressing one upstream variable in a system that still requires caloric deficit, adequate protein, and consistent movement to produce fat loss. But if the biology described above applies to you, these two evidence-based strategies may help modulate the cortisol side of the equation. Phosphatidylserine, often abbreviated as PS, is a phospholipid found naturally in cell membranes, concentrated in high metabolic activity organs, including the brain. It is also available as a supplement derived from soy or sunflower lecithin. Multiple peer-reviewed clinical trials have examined its effect on cortisol output via the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal, or HPA, axis, the chain of signals that tells your adrenal glands how much cortisol to release. A placebo-controlled study published in a European pharmacology journal found that oral phosphatidylserine at 800 milligrams per day for 10 days significantly blunted ACTH and cortisol responses to physical exercise stress. A separate double-blind crossover trial published in the Journal of the International Society of Sports Nutrition tested 600 milligrams of soy-derived PS for 10 days and found a statistically significant reduction in cortisol area under the curve, 35%, compared to placebo, alongside a significant increase in the testosterone to cortisol ratio. Most relevant for chronic stress, a randomized placebo-controlled study published in a neuroscience journal examined the effects of a phosphatidylserine and phosphatidic acid complex, PAS, on 75 chronically stressed men. At a dose of 400 milligrams per day, the supplementation normalized the ACTH, salivary cortisol, and serum cortisol responses to an acute psychosocial stressor, but only in the subgroup of high, chronically stressed subjects. In low-stressed subjects, no significant effect was observed. This last finding matters enormously for how you think about PS. It is not a cortisol blocker in healthy, low-stress individuals. Research suggests it appears to help normalize an overactivated HPA axis, which is precisely the condition that chronic stress and disrupted sleep create. Important caveats. Most studies are relatively short, days to a few weeks. Sample sizes are modest, and the research has largely been conducted in male subjects. The evidence is promising but not definitive for a general population. You cannot supplement your way out of chronically disrupted sleep. The research on sleep and visceral fat is clear enough that optimizing your sleep architecture may be the single highest leverage intervention for this specific pathway. Here is what the research points to. Cortisol follows a precise circadian rhythm. It peaks sharply in the morning, called the cortisol awakening response, and should reach its lowest point near midnight. Disrupting this rhythm through late-night light exposure, irregular bedtimes, or short sleep duration blunts the nadir and raises average daily cortisol exposure. A review published in Nature Reviews Endocrinology documented that insufficient sleep and circadian misalignment predispose individuals to poor metabolic health and promote weight gain, with appetite hormone disruption and visceral fat accumulation among the documented outcomes. The same JACC study showing 11% visceral fat increase in sleep-restricted participants used a controlled inpatient protocol where catch-up sleep did not reverse the visceral fat that had accumulated, underlining that prevention of disruption is more effective than recovery. Practically, research on cortisol circadian biology points toward 3 habits. Consistent wake time. Your cortisol awakening response is anchored by the time you wake, not when you fall asleep. A consistent morning wake time is the primary synchronizer of the HPA rhythm. Morning bright light exposure within 30 to 60 minutes of waking. Published circadian research shows that morning light exposure anchors your cortisol peak at the appropriate early morning window, supporting full decay by evening. Darkness and temperature drop before bed. Your cortisol nadir corresponds with your core body temperature nadir. Reducing light and ambient temperature in the 90 minutes before bed supports the drop your cortisol system is designed to execute. None of these habits require supplements or equipment. All of them address the circadian biology that published research links to visceral fat's preferential cortisol sensitivity. The goal is not to eliminate cortisol. You need it. The goal is to restore the rhythm, a clear morning peak, a steady afternoon decline, and a genuine nocturnal nadir. That rhythm is what keeps visceral fat cells from sitting in a prolonged activated state. Here is what you now understand that most people and many clinicians don't connect. Your visceral fat is not simply responding to calories, it is responding to a hormone. And that hormone has far more docking stations on visceral fat cells than it does on the fat beneath your skin. This is not speculation. It's documented in tissue research, in animal models, and in controlled human trials. Chronic stress, poor sleep, and the hormonal rhythm disruption that comes with modern life after 40 create the precise conditions that activate those docking stations, even when you're eating well, even when you're exercising. This does not mean cortisol is the only variable in visceral fat loss. Caloric deficit still matters, protein still matters, movement still matters. But if you've been doing those things and the visceral layer won't move, this may be the upstream variable you haven't looked at. 2 things to take away right now. First, assess your sleep honestly. Not sleep quantity alone, sleep rhythm. Are you going to bed and waking at consistent times? Is your cortisol getting a genuine nocturnal drop? Second, if you're chronically stressed and want to explore the evidence around phosphatidylserine, the doses used in the clinical trials that showed HPA normalization in high-stress individuals were in the 400 to 800 milligram range. Run that by your healthcare provider before starting anything new. Your body is not broken. It is responding to hormonal signals in exactly the way its biology dictates. Understanding this mechanism doesn't guarantee easy fat loss, but it gives you a more accurate map of the territory. If this video gave you a clearer picture of the cortisol-visceral fat connection, let me know in the comments. Type receptor if you're going to work on your sleep rhythm first. Share this with someone who's frustrated with belly fat that won't respond to diet. They may not have heard this mechanism explained before. Subscribe for more evidence-based metabolic health content. No hype, just the research.